Hey guys, welcome to Terrifying Tales. In this video we are going to represent you a story about a scary wolf cult. Jaelynn hadn't spoken to her mother in over 10 years. When she received the call, her mother had passed away. Now Jaelynn sat in a diner in some random drive-through town drinking her coffee, thinking what a shit show the place was. She couldn't wait to be back home in California. It was her first time in Oregon, but so far all she had seen were small towns she had long escaped. The diner had a total of 3 guests. Perhaps 4 guests if the lady who couldn't sit still, wearing a Goodwill fur coat, a black leather skirt with her ass hanging out of them, and buffed-up black knee-high leather boots, has a +1. The lady, whose roots were showing in her bleached hair, chewing on the inside of her lip, couldn't stop looking out the window and constantly fidgeting with her fingers and skirt. She would stand, sit, stand again, go to the bathroom, come back, sit outside, come in, sit, and stand. It was no wonder the lady's cheap boots were scuffed up. Occasionally they would make eye contact, but Jaelynn wasn't scared if the lady knew she was watching her. If the dumpster Barbie didn't want the attention, she needed to calm down. The waitress was a robust Mexican lady, with a thick black mane braided down her back to her butt. The waitress completely ignored the fidgety woman as if it was standard behavior. Instead, with a plate full of food in her hand, she walked to an older gentleman. His peppered beard covered most of his face, and he was abnormally skinny. His bony hands reached for the plate in the waitress's hand. She scolded him, warning him it was hot, and sat it down in front of him. She returned to the kitchen, and he began to pile ketchup onto his hash browns. The man looked as if he had insomnia and suffered a lonely life that dragged him to have breakfast all alone, early in the morning before the sun even rose. He brought the fork to his mouth and ate as if even the food tasted dull in his life. The third was another man asleep in the farthest booth. He ordered a coffee and toast, the 2 cheapest things on the menu. He had taken a bite of his toast before passing out on the table. Jaelynn imagined he had some pet flies with him, though she couldn't see any. She imagined he smelled terrible. The idea was solidified when the lady with the fur coat came out of the bathroom for the 5th time and scrunched her nose when passing by him, causing her Barbie pink lips to become a tiny lipless line on her face. Jaelynn was torn from her train of thought when the waitress approached. "Another top off?" She nodded her head and put out her cup. It was a clean ceramic white mug with black coffee stains from not being too careful. Gosh, she missed home. She had sworn she would avoid places that reminded her of her childhood, anything low-life-like. As the waitress finished filling Jaelynn's cup, the cowbell on the door rang, informing everyone there was a new guest. "Welcome, please find a seat anywhere," the waitress sang over her shoulder. Out of boredom, Jaelynn turned to judge the new patron. "Well, hello," Jaelynn thought to herself as she watched the man walk in. He wore nice branded dark leather cowboy boots that fit his large feet well. His dark jeans, bleached in some areas due to hard work, fitted his thick thighs and tush, causing Jaelynn to blush upon noticing. He had a nice clean shirt and well-groomed facial beard that added emphasis to his cheekbones and made his brown eyes noticeable for miles. He was heart-stopping attractive, and Jaelynn felt her heart skip a few beats. The waitress, however, didn't seem fazed by his demigod-like looks. Instead, she went about her business. His eyes caught Jaelynn's, and she dodged, staring too long at him. This time, actually afraid of what the other person might think. "Darren!" the fidgety lady screamed and practically leaped into his arms. Figures, she thought with a tinge of jealousy, and went back to sipping her coffee. She watched as the story unfolded. Darren pushed the woman off him almost immediately and looked in Jaelynn's way as if to say they weren't in an intimate relationship. Jaelynn rose an eyebrow and took another sip of her black coffee. "Sorry buddy, can't fool me." Then they sat at the woman's booth, and he called the waitress to get them something to eat and drink. The lady's buffed-up black boots clambered on the floor as she fidgeted. Since he arrived, she hadn't stopped staring at him, as if begging him to take away her pain. Jaelynn had no doubt she was also staring at his sculptured lips that were even plumper than most women's, or his eyes hidden behind thick dark eyelashes. They spoke in very hushed tones. Are they talking about something illegal? Jaelynn allowed her mind to wander at the thought of this fidgety girl killing someone and now calling Darren to be her knight in shining armor. They spoke for only a few seconds. The waitress hadn't even had time to bring them their drinks when he got up abruptly and walked outside. The lady began to tear up a bit, but quickly wiped them away. Outside, Darren was making a phone call. He had one hand in his pocket and was kicking around gravel on the sidewalk. Jaelynn had a perfect view of his profile through the window. Darren was still in mid-call when he looked into the window as if searching for her and felt very satisfied to see that she was indeed watching him. He gave her a cocky smile, and Jaelynn quickly turned away. She felt a sudden need to flee the awkwardness and hurried to the bathroom. She passed by the man, still dead asleep, and she scrunched her nose. Yep, he had to have some pet flies somewhere. She quickly used the bathroom, cleaned up, and then went out to pay. All set? The waitress asked as she dashed to the cash register. Yeah, can you throw an extra 20 on my tab and give that man a proper meal, either for today or when he needs it? Jaelynn asked, tossing her head to the man sleeping near the bathroom. Paying for others' meals when she went out was not uncommon. When she was younger, she had found many warm-hearted strangers who had made moments of her childhood survivable. The waitress's eyes lit up with a smile. Ah, por supuesto, she said out of excitement and a half to herself. Of course, that's very kind of you, she said, swiping Jaelynn's card. Jaelynn thanked the waitress and began to walk to her car, breathing in the fresh, cool air. Where are you headed off to? A strong voice came with the ring of the cowbell as it opened again. Jaelynn turned to see the handsome man following her outside. It kissed her ego that he came to talk to her, but something was off. He seemed different from when he first walked into the diner. Home? She said with a polite smile and turned to continue walking to her car. Where's that? He asked, and she almost froze. She was thankful she didn't. She felt an urgent need to get to her car before he caught up. A long way from here, she said over her shoulder. She walked as quickly as she could without causing alarm and went to open the door. There was enough space between her and the man. She should have been able to get into the car and close the door before she was in any real danger. Should have. As she went to open the door, it was quickly closed by the man's sizable tan hand. She noticed the odd faded tattoo on his hand. Just below his knuckles were 4 dots in an upside-down triangle. Near his thumb was another tattoo that looked like the different cycles the moon goes through. A startled scream snuck out of her lips. She promptly bit them shut and looked up. Can I at least get your name? He asked, peering down at her. She searched his eyes. They seemed glazed over. Did he take a hit of something while she was in the bathroom? Was that why he was here? To meet his tweaker drug dealer and get high, maybe even enjoy kidnapping and raping the pretty girl in a diner all alone too early in the morning for anyone to notice. She began to tremble but forced herself to speak. Sasha, she lied, using her best friend's name back home. He breathed in while thinking about her name, then let out a burly grunt. Can I get your number, Sasha? Jaelynn freaked. She wanted to say no but didn't see it going well if she did. Sure, she said, and went inside her purse for a pen and paper. He laughed at her, causing her to flinch in response. What are we in, the 90s? Just put it directly into my phone. No need to waste paper. She nervously smiled up at him and reached for his phone. Right, she giggled nervously. She did little to conceal her shaking hands as she typed her number. Where there was a 1 in her number, she purposely put a 2. Here you are. Jaelynn knew he knew she was shaking. As he took the phone from her, he placed his big burly hand over hers. It did little to calm her nerves. You all right? Yeah, her voice stuttered. Just so much colder than inside. He raised an eyebrow at her. She watched as he hit a few buttons on his phone, and her heart dropped deep in her stomach when she realized he was calling her. He raised the phone to his ear, and even from where she was standing, she could hear the tone of the lady's voice telling him, I'm sorry, the number you had dialed is currently out of service. Please hang up and try again. Fuck me, she thought. That's strange, she said, urgently reaching for his phone again. Are you trying to give me the wrong number? He asked with a bit of frustration in his voice. Jaelynn almost wanted to cry. She just wanted him to leave her alone. No, she laughed nervously. Darren wasn't that stupid, but she hoped he was. She pretended to look over the number again. Oh, look here. I accidentally put a 2 instead of a 1, she said as she showed him the error. She quickly fixed it and gave it back to him. Here, try that. He gave her a questioning look as he tried to dial again. This time her phone vibrated in her bag. She fished it out, showed it was his number, then answered it. See, it's me, she said on the phone, speaking a beat faster than before. His heavy gaze stared down at her. I should go. I have a long drive ahead of me. He suddenly reached over her without saying anything, causing her to flinch. She closed her eyes shut until she heard the clink of her car door opening. Drive safe. Jaelynn nervously smiled and half nodded her head as she took her moment to flee. Thanks. I'll be calling you, he said, raising the phone. I'll be answering, she nervously responded as she tried to rip the door from his hand. The car door didn't even budge. What now? Your seatbelt. He made a pointed gesture to her. Jaelynn took a quick short breath as she buckled up and prayed he would let her go. She looked up at him, and he gave his nod of approval. Then he closed her door. Jaelynn smiled back at him as he gave her a wave goodbye. It took no time to lock the doors. She fumbled to put her key in the car, now not holding back, cursing to herself. Leave it to my shithead mom to live in some low-life tweaker town. I have half my mind not even to give her a proper burial. Jaelynn took off, causing the dirt parking lot to become one cloud of dust. Thank you so much for reading the first chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3Ps grammar Nazis are welcome. Jaelynn took the 40 miles per hour road going 60 miles per hour. She fidgeted with her rearview mirror, turned the music up and turned the heater on, warming her cold, stiff fingers. She was still on edge about the whole confrontation. She reminded herself that she would get this over with, and before the weekend was finished, she'd be back in her nice comfortable home, only worrying about her nice comfortable job as a financial advisor. She took a few loud breaths as she drove. She tried to sing along with the music to relax, but it did nothing for her nerves. As she took the winding road, her heart clenched. A vehicle caught up to her at an unnerving speed. Fuck, she thought, being paranoid, but sped up all the more. Was she being followed? When the truck tailgated her, despite her speeding, the red and blue lights came on and calmed her nerves. It was just an undercover cop. 3RX5 TV, and you said you were on Wesley Road. That is correct. Ma'am, we have no police currently in that area calling for a pullover. I'm sending a car now to meet you en route, but don't stop before they arrive. She couldn't register what the lady was saying on the phone. Her nerves were flying off the wall. She had to force herself to speak. Okay. Fuck. Jaelynn hyperventilated as she processed the lady's words and made the wrong move to speed up. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to remain calm and stay on the phone with me. As she sped, the truck flashed its lights. Shoot, how long until the cops arrive? Our nearest unit is about 10 minutes out. Jaelynn let out a nervous laugh as she dibbled on her lips. Her voice betrayed her. I don't think I can wait that long. Ma'am, everything will be all right. Just remain calm. What road markers do you see so far? I see nothing. There's nothing here. She tried to look, but with the flashing of the truck's brights behind her made it complicated. All right, keep your eye out. Is it just you in the car? Yes, I am alone. The shakiness in her voice made her feel like crying. She would even give for her foul mother to be in the car with her, anyone, so she wouldn't be alone right now. Jaelynn clenched the phone in her hand as she tried to drive. Up the road was a green light reflecting from her car lights. A road marker. There's a road marker up ahead, she shouted into the phone. 3. The phone jolted out of her hands as she braced herself. The truck was now strategically hitting the back of hers. She let out a scream. It took both hands on the wheel to stay in lane. She looked down at the passenger side floor and saw her phone light up. It showed her home screen of a yellow daisy she grew in her garden back home. She narrowed her eyes and her heart sunk. There was no sign she was still on the phone with 911. Fuck me, she now knew she was on her own. There was no way she could reach for her phone. Think, she lost all thought as the truck reared into her again. A scream bellowed from her lips. The police know the direction I'm headed, so I need to stay on this trail as much as possible. Jaelynn thought as she punched the pedal to the floor. She took some space from the truck, which was now honking, flashing its lights, and trying to catch up to her. Jaelynn's phone rang. She looked down at it from where it lay, wishing she could answer it. Her heart froze when she saw the unknown number coming in. Her mind flashed back when Darren called her phone, and she answered it to say it was her number. She remembered glancing at the phone only quick enough to find the answer button, then nervously met Darren's gaze as he looked down at her with his heavy brown eyes and eyelashes so thick that no doubly lured his prey to him. She didn't remember his number, but she vaguely remembered it also ended in a 62. What would be the coincidence, she thought as she shook her head, trying to fight the truth. No, she cried. She had no clue what was going to happen to her. She tried to stay en route, but it seemed hopeless as the vehicle caught up to her and rammed her from behind again. Just then, she saw the light come in from the other direction. It was still far away, but she knew her little car would not last until the cops came. She flashed her lights at the oncoming car. She turned into the car's lane quickly and hit the brakes. The truck behind her didn't expect this to happen and pushed into her one last time, causing her to lose the wheel. The car spun out of control. The vehicle from oncoming traffic blared its horn and broke as fast as possible. Jaelynn attempted to gain control of the car, but by doing so, she felt her car lift in the air and come back down to earth with a thud. It landed the wrong way, causing the car roof to crunch inward, not allowing her head to have the needed space. Then she felt as the car lifted and rolled again and again. She clenched her jaws shut so tightly that the screams remained in her chest. She felt her left cheek smack into the car window moments before the glass shattered. The glass shards brushed against her skin. Her head smacked the roof hard on a pointed area and then flung forward, hitting the steering wheel, connecting straight to her nose. She felt it break, but couldn't hear anything over the loud crunches of the car rolling down the hill. Then she blinked, and it was like she'd never open her eyes again. She felt herself go in and out of consciousness. She was suspending upside down from her seatbelt. An odd chill ran down her body at the recollection of Darren telling her to buckle up before he let her leave. Had he known? She tried to open her eyes, but the warm liquid covered her face, not allowing her to open them. She blinked, but it was no use. Her body felt numb, but her heart still patted like a racehorse running away from danger. She knew she had to run away. What the hell, Colton? The chilling scream of a familiar voice echoed. She felt her body turn to ice as she heard the gruff male tone. He was pissed, but it was still undoubtedly his voice. Any hope that she was overreacting faded away with his footsteps. I told you to pull her over, not run her off the road and kill her. I'm sorry, boss. She was calling the cops. How the fuck did she know you weren't a real cop? The lights went out. Hell, call Joshua now and tell him to get on it. She could hear them talking as feet slid ungraciously down the hill. Her car just rolled down. She quickly fumbled for the seatbelt. As she undid the belt, her head fell to the vehicle's roof with a smack. All was black. Thank you so much for reading the second chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps, grammar Nazis are welcome. Jaelynn's head rang as she came back to reality. The scent of the room smelled like musty, old flowers. For a second she thought she was in her old room. When she was 7 years old, living in her deceased grandmother's home, with her mama chain-smoking on the porch, waiting for the place to be foreclosed and owned by the bank. She felt a pang of sadness when she thought about how mama had let herself go after Granny had passed. Granny was the only person in the world who kept mama in line. Otherwise she would be with the next man that would be bad for her, loving her like fire, eating away the wood and being gone just as fast. Another heartache that would take her through another bender. Jaelynn went to think about whether mama was with a new man, but that was as far as it got when she realized there was a foreign sound. She fought to figure out where so was. She felt comfort as she listened to the steady beep of the machine monitoring her heart rate. She must be safe. A faint memory led her to believe she was in the hospital, and she almost ignored the beeping to sleep some more. However, when she opened her eyes, her blissful sleep was short-lived. There was no way she could fall back asleep, especially knowing the glimpse of the walls did not have the same sterile white wallpaper as most hospitals. Her eyes shot open, and she immediately regretted it. They landed on a man rocking in a rocking chair, looking sternly at her. Even in the dimly lit room, his facial features were hard not to notice. It was him. It was Darren. She quickly sat up in fear but didn't get too far. Sounds of chains rattling matched the sight of her left hand handcuffed to the bed. She looked at it in curiosity, then looked to the other hand to see it matched. Heart pounding, she looked to where her feet should be, covered by a blue flowered quilt so old it was probably someone's great-grandma's quilt. She felt the ropes tightly bounding her feet to the bed. The room smelled of dust from the lack of use. The walls had old flowery wallpaper, and the floor ratty brown carpet, probably from the 50s. Light shone into the room, but only through the spaces of the windows that were boarded up. Her heart sunk as she looked back at Darren. Should she talk? Would that help her out of this situation? She didn't know. So she just remained quiet, swallowing her tears and looking back at him, trying everything to read his expression. He had none. His face was completely blank as he stared back at Jaelynn, rocking back and forth casually. He lifted his hand to pet his beard and looked at her, deep in thought. Her eyes caught on the tattoo of the 4 dots above the upside-down triangle. Before she could think too much about it, he interrupted her thoughts. You left so abruptly at the diner. I didn't have the time to talk to you properly. He continued to stare at her but knew she wouldn't respond. Instead, she stared at his tan skin, noting the slight wrinkle under his eyes. They told a story of a man who was outside every day. He sighed. I am sorry you were brought in the way you were. That was not my intention. I suppose we have a lot to talk about, but first let's get something straight. Lying is not tolerated in the compound. He paused, looking at Jaelynn with such disappointment she feared him all the more. Do you have something to come clean about? Jaelynn watched his every move down to the twitch in his jawline. This couldn't be happening. Being kidnapped is only something that happens on television, not in real life, not with her. She felt like this must be a nightmare, but it felt real, very real. She swallowed her shaky breath. I don't believe I have lied. He stood abruptly, took his fist, and pounded into the wall 4 times. Jaelynn gaped at the wall that now wore a large hole in it. She calmed her breathing as he hissed in his angry breath. You have, he grunted, pissed that she didn't come clean right away. She watched as he pulled from his jacket her wallet, and her heart sunk. Unless you were walking around with a fake ID. I'm sorry. I honestly forgot about that. I shouldn't have lied. Please forgive me. She stuttered out a plea before letting her brain think of what to say. His cold eyes looked towards her. And the phone number. Jaelynn didn't want to add to her deathbed by admitting she had lied on purpose, so she decided she'd have to lie again. A complete accident. I swear I was scared. I messed up. Darren gurgled his teeth back as he growled in anger at her. It was an odd reaction, and it made him look even more like an unhinged maniac. I can tell when you're fucking lying, he shouted at her and paced towards her. Being chained, she was vulnerable to him. Still, she tried to scurry away from him. I'm sorry, she screamed back, and then in a sob, I'm so sorry. I was just trying to protect myself. I was scared. He stopped with his face in front of hers. Jaelynn could smell pine needles and his mouthwash on him. He was close. He slowly came up to pet her forehead. She jumped a bit by the touch. She was not oblivious to the sting of pain it caused her. She knew she was hurt, probably why her head was ringing. He spoke softly. "You have nothing to be afraid of now, my moonlight." She shuddered at his voice. "The goddess has chosen me to protect you." He kissed her forehead. The unwelcome touch of his warm lips caused bile to sit just before her throat. Darren's calloused hand guided her chin up to look at him. She met his brown-eyed stare before setting her gaze on his right ear, noting the black hooped earring and the tiny cornrow that was tied off with a bead. "From now on, only the truth, okay?" She heard what he was saying, but couldn't process it. "The goddess, what the hell?" Jaelynn nodded her head as she cringed a bit. Tears spooled from her eyes. "Are you in pain?" he asked her, and she wanted to lie. She didn't want any drugs to blur her mind. She was scared to lie to him, scared of what he might do. So she chose to nod her head yes. "Let me get the doctor." He walked to the wooden door and poked his head out. "Get Marshall." He snapped outside the door, and within seconds, a man about an inch shorter than Darren peered through the door. He wore little to hint he was a doctor. If she had to guess, they both worked the same job outdoors. His shirt and pants wore the same specks of dusts and grease stains. His face was longer than Darren's, but his features remained rough. Following behind him were two girls. They wore long flowery dresses that practically matched the old wallpaper. The dresses were modest and covered their whole bodies. Jaelynn looked down. She wasn't wearing much, but a see-through white gown a grandma would have worn to bed at night. Jaelynn wished she was more covered like the girls. The girls were silent and kept their heads down mostly. They snuck little glances at her as if to plead for Jaelynn to feel comfortable and safe. They both wore the same piggy tail braids, making them look more innocent and younger than they probably were. Darren caught the one with darker hair making eye contact, and he grunted at her, scolding her for looking Jaelynn's way. She bowed her head and fiddled with her dress. The girl with the blonde hair jerked her head slightly, revealing a terrifying red patch of skin surrounded by horrifying brown and purplish colors. As if she knew Jaelynn was staring, she meekly covered her. "Good afternoon, Jaelynn. Happy to see you are awake. I am Dr. Marshall. Can you look here for a moment, please?" Jaelynn complied and was rewarded with a bright light shining in her eyes, causing the ringing in her head to turn into a full-blown migraine. She tried not to squint away. Still, it didn't stop her from noticing the oddly placed scar that rippled through his skin, whiter than the rest of him. As he examined her eyes, she examined his scar. She was shocked when she could get a better view of it and see. It was 4 dots with an upside-down triangle, the same symbol Darren had tattooed on his hands. Only except Marshall's was not tattooed, it looked like it was burned into his skin, and because of that, it appeared with wavy lines of puffed-up skin. She couldn't help but to wonder whether Darren was also branded in a similar way. "Open your mouth for me," he said, pulling a popsicle stick from his pocket. Jaelynn hoped it was cleaned before he decided to use it on her. She opened, and the stick got pressed to her tongue as he looked down her throat. Then he grabbed a stethoscope and searched for her heartbeat. Darren shuffled loudly from foot to foot as if he was struggling with himself. His hand went through his hair, giving him a savage look. His eyes locked with Jaelynn's, and the glint of the light caused them to be a lighter shade of brown. She stared back, trying not to feel this other man's hands on her. It made her feel even more vulnerable. "Well, Darren," the supposed doctor said, sitting back on his heels. He looked down at Jaelynn, giving her a brief look. "Give her something to sleep and let us step outside to talk," Darren spoke as he motioned the girls to leave. "No," Jaelynn shouted. Everyone froze. Darren glared. "You need rest," he grunted. "Please, I don't want any more drugs," she pleaded. He ducked his head. "I'm sorry, maybe next time." Then he left the room. She was left alone with just the doctor, and she watched in horror as he took a needle from his pocket. It was already filled. She screamed bloody murder. "Please, please, please," she shouted repeatedly as he approached her. He tried to coax her to calm down, but she wasn't listening. One girl ran back into the room and grabbed her arm. She spoke. "Jaelynn, it's all right. No one is going to harm you. You're safe, you're safe." But all Jaelynn could think was, how safe could she be if they were the ones to put her here? Thank you so much for reading the 3rd chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps, grammar Nazis are welcome. Jaelynn came through once more with a jolt. She abruptly opened her eyes and looked to see if he was there, sitting in the rocking chair as he had the first time she awoke. No one was there. She checked the window and could tell it was nighttime. Her heart sunk. She had no clue how long she had been here. Even if it was just a day, she felt hopeless that no one had rescued her yet. No one even knew she had a mom. There wasn't a single person who knew she was driving a state over to deal with the funeral arrangements. No one knew except the police she called as her car was getting pushed off the side of the road. Surely they would be out looking for her, wouldn't they? Jaelynn felt a wave of rage wash over her body as she thought about how she should have let the taxpayers' dollars handle her mother's funeral arrangements. She thought about the last time she saw her mother alive, and how she left bags packed, slamming the screen door shut, screaming how this was the last time she would ever deal with her mother again. She marked that day heavily in her brain, and although she never spoke it out loud, she often thought about it daily, her brain constantly attempting to process past trauma. The only light in the room was the lamp on the bedstand next to the heart monitor. She stared off even now in this place of uncertainty, thinking about the bitterness of those memories, noticing a pitcher of water, crackers, and a container of Jell-O still fully packaged with a spoon on top. She was hungry, but her hands were still chained. She checked for Slack, but all they did was make a lousy rattling noise. Then she noticed something she didn't see before. On her right arm, away from the side with the light and heart monitor, was an IV attached. She breathed, trying to tell herself it was probably just saline water, though she felt it was strange that it wasn't here before. She immediately stopped examining when a door from another room opened, and a set of men's voices roared throughout the house. "Man, I fucking needed that run." Darren's strong voice echoed into her room, and she tried to push deeper into the bed as if that would allow her to hide. "Yeah, Colton and Joshua were able to get the car to the junkyard so that no one will look for her now. Do you think we pushed the cops far enough west? Oh yeah, no one will find her now. Plus, Joshua has already cleared our tracks," Darren grunted. "It was messy of Colton to put her life at risk. Will he be reprimanded?" "Fuck yeah, he will. We do it tomorrow night during her integrating ceremony." "All right, I'll have the ladies get everything set up." Jaelynn didn't have time to prepare herself when the door to her room suddenly swung open. It was as if he was trying to catch her off guard in the act of doing something she shouldn't be. She buried herself farther into bed as best as she could. Darren's gaze laid heavy on her but seemed different. He seemed light-hearted, much like when he walked into the diner. It was like he was two different people, which caused her heart to feel woozy. "You're up," he said in a happy voice, cheerful even. She looked at him cautiously. "Are you hungry?" he asked as he walked toward her. She quickly nodded her head yes. He grabbed the rocking chair from the corner, pulled it up next to her bed, got situated, and then grabbed the Jell-O and spoon. He worked at the seal as he spoke. "How did you sleep? You went down throwing quite the fit." Her cheeks blushed. "I didn't give you permission to drug me. It made me feel violated and unsafe." She spoke not as accusing him, but as explaining to him, feeling like she needed to stand up for herself. His composure changed for a split second, then returned to a more happy composure. Jaelynn let out a breath she didn't know she was holding in. His gaze burned holes into her. She tried not to look through his thick eyelashes as he whispered, "Thank you for your honesty. I'm sorry you felt that way, but soon you will understand I am your protector and you will learn to trust me." "Also," he said, leaning in very close to make sure his eyes met Jaelynn's as he declared, "I'll never need your permission to do anything." His words carried so many deeper meanings and she wasn't blind to them. In horror, she just stared back. She wanted to cry, but she held back for when she was alone again, where she could think freely. He slowly and carefully took the spoon and scooped up a bite-size amount of Jell-O. It jiggled as he brought it up to her lips. She looked at the spoon and then back up at him. In the most defeated voice, she asked, "May I please feed myself?" He seemed to think as he gazed down at her. Then he lifted the spoon and raised his eyebrows to say, "Eat." She did obediently, but he saw her struggling with it internally. He set the Jell-O down with a sigh. The silence caused her breath to quicken. "I don't mean to be so harsh on you. I know you are still new to my world," she spoke as he stood and fished inside his pocket. He pulled out a key and then walked to the opposite side of the bed. "We will unchain one hand so you can eat. The right one. That way you don't tear off the IV." He wrestled with the chains, and they sang at his touch, a beacon of light in a dark tunnel. The sound sang, "You are free." Jaelynn felt her heart warm and immediately brought her free hand to her chained one so they could soothe each wrist. Darren walked around the bed again and handed her the food. "I bet that feels better." Jaelynn simply nodded and then, with clammy hands, chugged the water and chowed down on her food. His eyes never left her as he watched her eat. She was all too aware of him staring, but she knew this couldn't stop her from eating because she needed to keep her strength up. She froze with a saltine cracker half in her mouth when his hand reached up to pet her cheek. "You are so beautiful," he said, staring into her eyes. Her stomach dipped at his testimony, but she took advantage of his good mood. "Will you ever unchain me?" he laughed. "Of course, this is just temporary." "Good," she said half to herself. What do you plan to do to me?" He took in her nervous expression and spoke softly. "You will live here with me. You are to be my mate." "Mate? Yes. My wolf has claimed you as mine." "Yours." She felt herself fall deeper into denial. "There's no way a maniac that thought he was a wolf kidnapped her." "Yes, mine. And when you're strong enough to endure the change, I will turn you, so we can complete the bonding." "The bonding? Turn me? What?" Jaelynn felt herself slowly hyperventilate. "Jaelynn, calm down." he snapped, his composure turning back to what she saw when she was about to get into the car. He was changing all right, changing personalities, but not into a what? A wolf? She knew this man sitting in front of her had lost reality and was dangerous. She couldn't stop herself from freaking out. Darren got up abruptly, causing her to flinch. She had to get her breathing under control. He stared down at her, heaving. She stared back, scared and timid. Get some rest, he snapped, and with that, left the room. Jaelynn was all alone in her silence. She sat staring at the door, wondering if he would come back. When she was sure he wouldn't return, she cried. Slow, muffled mourns escaped her as her body shuddered. She felt so helpless. Damn you, Mom, damn you, you had to ruin my life even after you're fucking dead. After some time she reached over, turned the lamp off and cried herself to sleep, using her time to worry. She woke to the sound of the lamp being turned on and the light breaking her sleep. She stirred. Good morning, Marshall said in a soft, chipper voice. Didn't mean to wake you. I just need to check your bag. Jaelynn used her one free hand to rub her eyes. Why do I have that now? Marshall softly laughed to himself. Sorry, I couldn't get my hands on all the supplies you needed right away. Jaelynn thought it was odd that he got his hands on a heart monitor first, but not an IV. She decided not to say anything. What's in the bag? She watched as he inspected what little was left. Just some goodies to keep you hydrated and happy. They should help you relax enough for the transition to this new life. It's almost done. I'll send the girls in to help you get cleaned up once it's finished, and then maybe we can show you around your new home. Darren wants to have your integration ceremony tonight, so there's a lot to do. How do you feel? Fine. What's an integrating ceremony? She reluctantly asked, not wanting to be friends with anyone here, but feeling his social personality could be useful. Nothing too official. Just we have customs for when a new person comes to our pack. Look at it as a party. Jaelynn didn't have time to react. There was one knock at the door, and then a younger scrawny boy busted in. He looked to be around 18. Sorry, Doc. Darren needs you. It's an emergency. All right, Jaelynn, hold tight. The girls will be in soon, he said in a scurry to follow the boy, leaving the door. Jaelynn sat bored and uncomfortable as she watched the bag drip substance into her veins. She wanted nothing more to rip it off, but her right hand could only reach her left hand. The ties by her feet prevented her from stretching to her elbow and peeling it off. Plus, she didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize her tour. She needed to know the predicament she was in. When it looked like her bag no longer had any liquid to give her, one girl from yesterday walked in, the one with darker hair. Good morning, Jaelynn, she said, heading straight to examine the bag. How are you? Jaelynn chose not to speak. Don't be afraid of me, please. My name's Kelsey. I'm a friend, I promise. Feeling sour, she retorted. Forgive me if I can't see you being my friend while I'm chained up. She frowned at the sarcasm. I've come to get you out of those chains and help you get cleaned up. Jaelynn perked up. Just her, no one else? She looked at the girl's skinny body. Her bones clung to her skin. Jaelynn could easily overpower this girl. She looked from the girl to the door and saw that it was ajar. Now hold still, this might sting a bit, Kelsey said as she peeled back the tape that kept the IV in place. Where am I? Jaelynn asked, trying her luck. You are at the compound. Where's the compound? Kelsey turned to Jaelynn. Please don't ask questions you know I can't answer. I'll have to report it to Darren. Jaelynn swallowed her tongue. Some friend, she dared to say under her breath. The girl gave her an angry look and then took the heavy flowery quilt off the bed onto the floor. Jaelynn's feet were turning black with how much circulation the ropes had cut off. She stared at her bare white legs and was shocked to see a tube from her crotch to somewhere over the bed. Jaelynn's mind went a million miles per second. They are pumping me with something. They are trying to make me pregnant. What's that? She asked, the nervousness evident in her voice. That's your catheter, and this, she said, holding up a bag, is a bag of your pee. When did they put that in me? I'm surprised you didn't feel it, Kelsey whispered. Jaelynn was also surprised. Just relax, this may feel weird, she spoke as she carefully removed the catheter. Jaelynn scrunched her face as the foreign feeling moved up her belly button. There, Kelsey stated. Now to get you out of these restraints. As Kelsey fished for the key to release her, Jaelynn's heart pounded so fast she was seeing black spots in her V-zone. The moment she's free, she would catch Kelsey off guard and make a run for it. Kelsey delicately unchained her hands in a calm and slow manner, but to Jaelynn nothing felt calm about this moment. Freedom, the idea roamed rapidly in her mind. She forced herself to pay attention to make sure there were no mistakes. She heard no one outside of the room. She practically saw the route out of this house so vividly she felt like she knew what every detail of the place would look like already. Kelsey worked away to untie Jaelynn. When she was free, she pulled her feet to her hands. She felt woozy from the lack of circulation and squeezed the tips of her toes, her attention heavily planted on Kelsey. Kelsey had turned to fold the quilt up nicely. There, that, she was in mid-sentence when Jaelynn built the courage to make a run for the door. Thank you so much for reading the 4th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, Please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps, grammar Nazis are welcome. 1 second she was feeling the relief of freedom as her feet touched the ground. The next, she felt the hard thud of the rest of her body following shortly behind. Kelsey dropped what she was doing and bolted towards. Jaelynn moaned from her unexpected fall, and it caused her to summon her nightmare. Any moan coming from you I do not cause makes me feel jealous, Darren said, peeking his head in the door. Kelsey, what are you doing to my mate? He asked, teasing her as he walked in. Jaelynn felt a spike of fear, and she was sure she was going to pass out from either the fear or the blood pulsating to her head. She met Kelsey's disapproving eyes and pleaded with her. Kelsey lipped the words, "Don't be stupid," then lifted her head to Darren and smiled. "She's fine, she just got up too fast." Darren's stern expression turned to Jaelynn, and she tried to cover herself from his eyes, praying that he wouldn't see through Kelsey's lie. She was well too aware of how vulnerable she was. "All set?" he asked, crouching down to her feet and rubbing some circulation back into them. They were so numb she couldn't even feel the pins and needles. Kelsey responded, "She's all set." She stood, grabbing the bag of urine and walking out. Jaelynn silently pleaded for Kelsey to stay. Darren smiled up at her as he lifted her up and sat her on the side of the bed. Then he grabbed one of her legs, pulling it towards him and massaging. She let out a silent gasp. "Sorry, I didn't realize they were on so tightly." Jaelynn just nodded, feeling odd, having his warm calloused hands rubbing her legs. He moaned in delight. So soft. Despite the disappointment she felt for failing, Jaelynn had to hold herself there. She knew she'd have to bide her time. Kelsey came back in with the blonde girl. They both had their hair in the same braids and new clean flowery dresses, still just as modest as the last. "Can we take her now?" the blonde asked. "Yeah, did you already remove all harmful objects from the bathroom, Chastity?" "Yes, sir, I did." "All right, take her away," he said, slapping his knees, then turning to Jaelynn. "Now, Jaelynn, don't make any trouble for these ladies, and I'll see you for breakfast." The girls helped Jaelynn to her feet and guided her out of her room. They walked down the old wooden hall to another door, which they opened and gently nudged her in. She could hear voices at the other end of the house and a glimpse of a man also in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. He smiled at her but quickly diverted his gaze. The bathroom was tiny. It barely had enough room for the bathtub, the toilet and the sink, let alone room for 3 more people. Kelsey started the bath as Chastity pried Jaelynn's white nightgown off of her. Jaelynn shivered from the cold. "We will get you warm in a second," Chastity spoke softly. Her somber blue eyes glistened as if trying to give Jaelynn comfort. "Hop in," Kelsey said, taking Jaelynn's body and leading it towards the water. Jaelynn complied and sat in the warm tub. It soothed her aches. The comfort rose through her body, and she cried involuntarily. Both girls cooed at her. "Oh no, don't cry, please," Chastity pleaded in a worried voice. Her hand rubbed the side of Jaelynn's arm. "You are safe here, we promise," Kelsey encouraged. Kelsey's voice was brighter than Chastity's, as if she was confident this was the place Jaelynn was meant to be. When Chastity spoke, it was somber and serious, much quieter. Chastity spoke, pulling her from her train of thought. "Plus it will only upset Darren. You're his mate, you know." "Yes, your emotions of being sad or scared will only upset his wolf," Kelsey added matter-of-factly. Then gave a nervous glance at the door as she lathered soap on a sponge. "His wolf won't understand that it's because you fear being here. And he could come unhinged," Chastity explained as she took the sponge from Kelsey. Jaelynn froze. "Unhinged, yes. Most werewolves don't think rationally when their wolves become upset, and it can be quite dangerous for everyone in the pack." Then Chastity added, "especially dangerous to their mates." Jaelynn examined Chastity's neck and wondered if another male did this to her in the name of being her mate. Chastity's eyes timidly shied from Jaelynn's, and she unconsciously fiddled with her hair near the wound, like she was trying to hide it. Jaelynn wiped her eyes, feeling angry. "You can't possibly believe Darren is a werewolf." The girls gave a solemn giggle. It sent a weary chill through her body. "We do. We are the only 2 girls still human in the compound," Kelsey explained, and Jaelynn noted Kelsey was quick to give her information. "Well, there is also Bailey, she used to be." Kelsey cut herself short and looked towards Chastity, who was giving her the stink eye. "That's why we are allowed to assist you right now," Chastity explained. "Yeah, we pose no threat to Darren," they spoke as they scrubbed her hair. "Who is Bailey?" Jaelynn asked. "She was supposed to be mated to. She is no one important." "Now close your eyes," Chastity snapped, cutting Kelsey short as she held a cup full of water up to Jaelynn's head. Kelsey looked toward Chastity. "I think she should know." Chastity just pursed her lips together and sternly shook her head. Jaelynn changed the subject, not wanting to lose the opportunity for knowledge. "Have you seen them turn?" The skepticism in Jaelynn's voice was evident. "No, it is forbidden for a human to see a werewolf change. I have seen a glimpse of one once by accident, but please don't tell the others. They will have me reprimanded," Kelsey whispered in a hushed tone. Her eyes widened as she looked into Jaelynn's eyes. It was clear Kelsey believed all of this. You can only see a werewolf turn once you have transformed into a werewolf yourself, right? Jaelynn was not buying it. She stared at these two girls in horror. They both seemed too timid and brainwashed. How does one become a werewolf? Jaelynn asked, thinking it couldn't get more ridiculous than this. The witches will come on the full moon and give you the changeling's root. Then your blood will combine with the blood of the pack. Through the night you will begin your transformation. By morning you will be a werewolf. So I'll be drugged and cut? Jaelynn asked, feeling the shock sinking in. Well, yes, but it will be worth it. Jaelynn turned to Kelsey. It was evident that she wanted this done to her. Her brown eyes beamed with excitement. Not to worry though, newcomers wait 3 moons before Darren turns them. Yeah, he doesn't like a disobedient pack. Close your eyes again. Jaelynn complied. So when do you two get to, change? My transformation is this coming moon, Kelsey said excitedly. Mine will be the moon after hers, Chastity said timidly. Close your eyes. Last time I promise, Kelsey said as she dunked the warm water over her head, rinsing the conditioner. The girls got her out of the tub and dried her off. They continued to speak about the compound and all of its horrors. They talked about these horrors as if it was the most extraordinary things that ever happened to them. Jaelynn couldn't see how. They plucked Chastity from her first year at a community college as a nursing student. She had decent grades and was engaged to her high school sweetheart. She went camping with her friends in Montana to celebrate their first semester of finals being over, and they returned home, and she simply didn't. She explained being chased by a group of 10 men and what she had thought at the time as hounds. She jumped into the river to get away, but couldn't swim. The current swept her under and she woke up in the compound. Kelsey's life wasn't as easy. She didn't have the luxury to go to community college. She lived in Nevada, where her dad was abusive, and she felt like she needed to stay at home and help her mom and her younger siblings. She went one night on a run to get groceries, and they took her in the parking lot. She said that they were already in the back seat of her car. She said she enjoyed the long car ride back to the compound where they had told her everything. Jaelynn's mind couldn't wrap around what they were saying. Chastity was in Montana. Kelsey was in Nevada. Jaelynn was in Oregon. She had asked Kelsey how long she was in the car, and she just smiled and shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. I slept most of the time. Jaelynn had realized that these girls also had no clue where they were. Even scarier was how they talked about how being kidnapped was a tremendous honor. Even Kelsey, who didn't have such an easy life, would have sure still cared enough about her family not to abandon them for the compound. When she had asked Kelsey, she just smiled. This is the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. Jaelynn kept those worries to herself. She felt like if they didn't think she was integrating, as they had called it, they might try to brainwash her like these two girls. Even stranger to the mind warp was that only girls were supposedly taken. There is a supposed curse on the werewolf community that only male werewolves could be born. Women had to be turned. It was a punishment for some crime done back thousands of years ago, supposedly. Jaelynn was aware of the all-too-convenient lie. She compiled a list of everything that didn't add up and continued to tell herself this to keep herself sane. But as the girls talked, she felt more and more desperate. Jaelynn looked in the mirror as they did her hair in the same braid as theirs. Her face was swollen, and parts of her chin, cheek, and forehead wore heavy purple and orange bruises. Her lip was partially split open, and she had a large cut on her right side eyebrow that oozed. They wrapped her up and had her slip on a blue flowery dress. The sight of the dress made her feel ill. It was the same blue flowery fabric as the bedsheets in her room, reminding her of her capture, telling her even though she had left the room she still couldn't leave. When they finished, they opened the door to a very impatient Darren, who looked over her dress and nodded approvingly before taking her to the kitchen table. There waited a bowl of oatmeal, plain toast, and milk. The table was full of men. Some looked like they had been out rolling in the dirt all night, and others looked clean and freshly woken. Darren's presence was heavy in the room as she sat at the table and ate. He didn't say a word to her but gave her long, serious glances as he spoke in low murmurs to the men. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but knew it was about business. She knew it could prove helpful, but her efforts remained futile. After she ate, Darren took her hand. She squealed at the touch, but Darren looked down at her, and a low growl emanated from his lips, causing her to follow him. He led her out the door. The grass was cold and wet between her toes. Her heart pounded, feeling a sense of freedom from being outside, and a fear that boiled deep in her gut from not knowing where he would take her. This is your new home, Jaelynn. Darren showed her around the compound. She tried to absorb as much information as she could. It was a plot of land with an assumably long driveway. She wondered how long it would take before the driveway took her to the main road. Nearest to the house looked like a barn and an oversized garage. As he pointed in their direction, she could hear the squeal of a pig and the cries of several goats. Surrounding the compound were mobile homes and tents. She tried to count the makeshift homes and got to about 9 when Darren declared she didn't need to wander through there, and it was best to stick to the large grassy lawn. It was a decent-sized lawn, and beyond the yard and small village of makeshift homes were thick woods. She heard no sign civilization was near. Still, she silently kept her head up. "You look worried," Darren asked, full of concern. Duh, what was there not to be worried about? Her safety, future, and whole life were currently in question. She was worried the cops wouldn't even bother to report a missing person, and she would be left SOL. There was only one thing that scared her the most. She dug up the courage to ask, So I am your mate, correct?" "That is correct," he said, cupping her face as if in love with the idea that Jaelynn was already accepting her fate. "Does that entail sex?" "It will." At his declaration, she felt her throat dry. She tried to swallow. She carefully worded her next words, "What if I'm not ready?" His hands lovingly caressed her hair as he laughed. "Jaelynn, it's your first day on the compound. I wouldn't have expected you to be ready yet. I won't touch you until after you have changed. Sex with your mate before the change has negative effects and can cause your change to be unsuccessful. But not to worry. I will take care of you." Her ears practically burned at his testimony. She was thankful she had 3 full moons until he changed her. By then she would have escaped and been free from this nightmare. However, what concerned her was how heavily everyone in the compound clung to this reality, one that was impossible to be accurate. Yet somehow, Darren and his men have used this to take advantage of the women and do their bidding without question. A noise rumbled through the driveway, causing Jaelynn's heart to skip a beat. A truck. Just as her hope for more plausible opportunities to escape came to mind, they vanished as she noticed the deep blue Ford pickup come into view. It was hard missing the fact that the front bumper was banged up a bit, and she knew instantly this was the truck that drove her off of the ledge. The so-called doctor hopped out and greeted them. "How's she doing?" Marshall asked as he made his way to them. Darren looked Jaelynn over. "I think she could use some more pain meds. Get her well rested for tonight, will you? I need to run some errands." She snapped her head up at Darren, silently pleading not to drug her again. "Sure thing," Marshall said as he handed Darren the keys. Darren gave Jaelynn's hand one squeeze, then went off. "Shall we?" Marshall asked with his hand raised in a gesture for her to walk in front of him. Jaelynn watched Darren climb into the truck. She glanced around the compound, then reluctantly complied, fighting the need to leave this place. Thank you so much for reading the 5th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps, grammar Nazis are welcome. The girls worked to put Jaelynn in a pale pink flower dress. They had her hair down with a waterfall-type braid. Jaelynn's natural curls flowed over her breasts as 2 little boys about 4 years old ran back and forth from outside to inside the tent with hands full of flowers that the girls picked through and braided into Jaelynn's hair. Outside they could hear the music and the hoop and hollering. Jaelynn felt nervous as she heard trucks pull up with more community members. How many were they? Kelsey hummed a tune to herself that eventually Chastity would sometimes hum too. Jaelynn twiddled with her fingers. "Stand and let me see," he demanded, and she slowly complied. She gave an awkward little twirl around and was rewarded with a soft groan she was sure only she could hear. He approached her and took in her scent. "You smell delectable." His hand gently wrapped around hers and he pulled her into him. He groaned again. "I can't wait till I can have you," he whispered in her ear, causing a shiver down her spine. He took a minute to enjoy her warmth before leading her out of the tent. "Come, it's time to start the integrating ceremony." Out on the field was a makeshift dance floor filled with people dancing in front of a large stage. There stood a man singing into a microphone and a DJ off to the side. Around the dance floor were many tables filled with guests. Jaelynn's eyes popped out of her head and she froze in step. There were so many people, especially men. There were way too many people okay with this man claiming he's a werewolf and stealing women. Were all these women kidnapped? How deep did the brainwash run? Darren held her hand and kept her hidden from the crowd. He pointed to the stage as 2 men she recognized as Joshua and Marshall each grabbed an arm of an already weak man. Jaelynn also quickly noticed it was Colton, the man who drove her car off the street. "It's time for him to be reprimanded," Darren explained. Jaelynn heard the girls talk in fear about being reprimanded, but they never told her what it entailed. She watched as they guided Colton to a wooden beam-like structure. They tied his ankles and hands so he was bent over the beam and completely vulnerable. The crowd had already silenced before the man with the microphone spoke. "Ladies and gents, it's time we reprimand our pack member for the carelessness of the deliverance of Darren's mate to the pack, putting her life in danger." The crowd booed. "It appears our pack leader has his hands full with a certain beauty, who I'm sure we are all excited to see later tonight. Marshall will do the honors." She dared a peek at Darren, knowing very well that the man was talking about her. Jaelynn watched as Marshall took a long stick from a boy in his teens and walked over to Colton. In Marshall's hands was a long black whip. He carefully unwrapped the leather string from the stick and readied his position. "Why are you here, Colton?" Colton mumbled. It was so quiet that she couldn't understand what he was saying. "Louder so everyone can hear. I recklessly endangered a pack member." His voice roared over the crowd. It sounded a bit slurred, as if he drank too much beforehand. "For the pack," Marshall shouted to the crowd as he lifted the whip, and the harsh slash cracked on the bareness of Colton's back. "For the pack," the crowd and Darren chanted back. Jaelynn shuddered at Darren's strong voice. She shook. Each time Marshall whipped Colton, the pack chanted louder, "For the pack." By the end of the brutal punishment, they all cheered as if happy to see someone get the life whipped out of him. Jaelynn stared in horror. It was a punishment she could do without. It made her escape even more detrimental. Her stomach turned to knots as she watched Colton vomit on the stage before Marshall and Joshua untied Colton and drug him off the stage. He yelped in pain from the simple movements. Then the man with the microphone caught sight of Jaelynn and Darren, and her worst nightmares came true as he called for them. "Ladies and gents, our guest of honor has now arrived. Better prepare your drinks because I hear a toast coming on." Everyone stopped and searched to find Jaelynn hidden among them. Eventually, all eyes were on her. Darren smiled ear to ear as he dragged her to the stage. She stood, frozen, as if she stood still enough they wouldn't know she was there. But in reality she was a deer staring at headlights, and she was about to be run over. Her heart pounded outside her chest. Darren took the microphone and spoke, "To our newest member and my mate, Jaelynn." "Jaelynn." They all raised their glasses and drank. The other man on the stage quickly handed her a glass. She stared at the white champagne bubbles. Upon further examination, it smelled like champagne and tasted like it. Thank God she downed it in one go. Where could she get some more of that? Darren was suddenly on her like a beast during mating season. His face buried into her neck, smelling her as he wrapped his arms around in front of her. "Welcome, mate," he groaned seductively to her. It brought a tingle down her spine as she wished she could remove the feeling. She knew she couldn't stay here. "Let's dance," he whispered to her as he guided her down the stage, barely giving her any space. It was like he couldn't resist himself to touch her, and she felt herself laughing along with him. When they reached the stage, he twirled her and she swayed with laughter. "Wait, something's not right." The thought left her mind as fast as it came as he swung her around the dance floor. His touch caused trails of heat to rise from her body. She couldn't stop smiling or laughing, especially every time he had to steady her because she was laughing so hard. "Wait." Soft lips met hers, and she welcomed them, groaning as the kiss deepened and the hands became more demanding. Jaelynn didn't feel sore anymore or scared. She just felt complete bliss from this kiss she would never want to end. Sir, we have a problem in the woods." Jaelynn whined as she saw Joshua standing in front of them, acting very nervous. Darren looked down at her and gave her one last kiss. "Be a good girl and stay here." She giggled as she stumbled to stay on her feet. "All right," she said, smiling into his eyes. Both men walked to the edge of the party where they spoke. Joshua was worried about something. Jaelynn watched as Darren's facial expression soon mimicked Joshua's. "What's wrong?" Jaelynn thought, feeling worried for Darren. Then somehow, Jaelynn heard a clip of someone's conversation. "Cops?" She stumbled a bit, this time almost hitting the floor. What was she doing? Fear sunk in as she realized she was drugged. She had to get out of here. She looked out into the crowd and watched as several men dispersed from the party. The cops were in the woods headed here. She knew the cops had no clue about the number of people at the compound. She'd have to go to her rescuers. She had to sober up to slip behind the stage with no one seeing her. She took a breath to focus on her escape. The time was now. Thank you so much for reading the 6th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps grammar Nazis are welcome. She fought the haziness of her brain as she worked to focus. Her hands were clammy and she felt nipped by the cold air. Her heart was pounding so hard that it made it impossible to concentrate. Swaying a bit, she saw a row of about 6 vehicles lined up not too far away from her. She trekked as fast as she could with bare feet to the cars. She checked to make sure no one saw her and then went to open the door to the blue Ford truck. The truck she recognized as the one that drove her off the road. It was locked. Heart pounding and nervous, she crouched down and moved to the passenger side. Each time her heart pulsated, eager for a door to be unlocked. Each time the door was locked. By the third car, she reached out for the door, feeling the same anxious excitement for it to be unlocked, and was met with the least expected result. She jumped at the blaring of the car alarm and made haste to the woods. She wasted no time thinking. Alongside the woods was a road that the cars must drive down, so she followed that. She ran as fast as possible despite the rough gravel, sharp rocks, and thorns that found their way to her feet. The pain was worth the freedom. As she ran, the racing of her heart seemed to intensify, the drug running through her veins. By now it became even more impossible to think. She did everything in her power to keep moving. A howl broke through the sky, and it sounded near to her. Jaelynn turned to see if she could see the beast. As she did, she stumbled and fell. She woke from her sleep in a matter of seconds, feeling like she should go back to sleep but knowing she had to rise to run away. Her body was as heavy as bricks. She could hear the crunching of footsteps behind her. All she could do was just lay there. "All right, back you go," Darren grunted as he lifted her. Jaelynn moaned in protest. Her eyes opened to still being at the party. Everyone danced and sang as if there were no cops in their backyard. She glared at every one of them as realization sunk in. What could happen to her now that they had caught her trying to run away? Darren's glare came into view as he gazed down at her. His expression was utterly unreadable besides his heavy breathing. Jaelynn's heart sunk. "Darren, his voice came softly with his anger barely composed, causing Jaelynn to realize the trouble she was in. "Save it, lies will only get you into more trouble than you are already in." Jaelynn gulped at his words. "Someone get her some water," he spat. Kelsey hurried over with pure fear filling in her eyes. She gave Jaelynn a pitied look as she handed the water bottle to her. Jaelynn looked over it with suspicion. "Drink, Jaelynn. I need you sober for what I'm going to do to you." Tears filled her eyes as she obediently took a sip. Images of Colton being beaten came to mind. She wasn't sure if she could handle that amount of brutality. "More," he demanded, and she complied. "Next time, think twice before trying to run away from a werewolf." She froze. She had heard the howl before she was knocked out. Was that a wolf or just a coincidence? Jaelynn sat in fear for what felt like a couple of hours. She watched the partygoers enjoy their time. Not one person other than Kelsey had looked her way and given her any sympathy. Darren stood brooding the whole time, standing guard. He offered no gentle glances, and she knew it was wise not to speak. She just sat, cried, and waited. Her heart clenched in her stomach as she watched the boys roll back the wooden beam onto the stage. Another man consulted with Darren. "Yeah, she's ready now," she could hear him say. She broke down in tears. Darren turned to her, still sternly looking at her. "You put this on yourself. You need to learn our ways. Now come." With shaking legs, she rose and followed him. She could hear the man on the stage make the announcement, but she couldn't distinguish the noise. Heat rose to her ears. She suddenly felt too hot. And then, unexpectedly, she leaned over and vomited. The sour liquid burned her nose and scorched her throat as she heaved all she had out of her body. No one came to help her or offer a helping hand. Instead, she rose to Darren impatiently, waiting for her to stop wasting his time. She wiped her mouth the best. "Lean over the beam, please," Darren directed her, and she slowly complied. It was slightly higher for her than Colton, and when she leaned over wholly, her toes barely touched the ground. Darren came around to strap her hands and legs in. "Remember, I don't want to be doing this to you. This is for your own good," he reasoned with her, touching her cheek softly. "Please don't," was her last attempt for refuge, and it was left in the air. Darren came around back, cracked the whip in the air so she knew what was coming, and then flicked the whip onto her back without hesitating. The dangling leather tail flew onto her pure, undamaged skin and stung like a bee. She felt the welt instantly rise. She didn't even bother to be strong. She screamed bloody murder as she felt the whip crack repeatedly. The crowd chanted, "For the pack! For the pack!" They seemed to enjoy watching her be beaten even more than Colton. 16 slashes later, Darren paused. "Jaelynn, what are the rules you have broken?" Unwilling to admit she'd done anything wrong, she had to bite her tongue and play along to avoid the sting of the whip. I ran away, and I'm sorry, and I won't do it again." "That's great, Jaelynn. But what other rules have you broken?" Nervous about being whipped again, she scrambled through her mind. She wasn't sure what else Darren wanted. "I don't know. You don't believe we are werewolves." His icy voice slicked over her. He rose and cracked the whip again. "Do you believe we are werewolves?" she cried from the pain. She couldn't take much more of it. "I believe you all are werewolves," he hit her again. "I can tell when you're lying, Jaelynn. Do you believe we are werewolves?" "Yes," her broken voice screamed. The whip cracked again, and the question was asked again and again. Thank you so much for reading the 7th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps grammar Nazis are welcome. Jaelynn sat at the kitchen table feeling null of all emotion. She didn't think about being brainwashed or running away. All she thought to herself was, werewolves are real. Sometimes she would have the occasional mental battle. No, they aren't real. Shut up, werewolves are real. Werewolves are real. Chastity stood in the kitchen pouring hot water into cups of tea. She set the cups near Kelsey, who was combing Jaelynn's wet hair and putting it into a lovely braid. Chastity left the room with one mug still in her hand. There was a burly grumble of a male voice, and then moments later Chastity returned empty-handed with tears pricking her eyes. The girls did not talk to Jaelynn. They only spoke to each other when it was about something necessary. Darren and the other men stood just outside the door that led to the outside. Their voices rumbled through the walls, but no words could be made out. All Jaelynn knew was that it was a serious conversation. "Here, Jaelynn, drink this. It will help you sleep," Chastity said, pushing the cup closer to her and then squeezing her hand for a quick sign of comfort. The little comfort she gave Jaelynn did not last long. The door to the outside swung open, and Darren's large boots clunked, bringing bits of dust inside. Even with a scowl on his face, Jaelynn could admire his feature, perhaps even more with his scowl. She thought of how his soft lips had touched hers as they swayed on the dance floor, how she laughed with him and how happy they both were. Why did she have to ruin the night? His scowl was because of her. This was her fault. She looked up, pleading with him. She heard his boots make noise on the floor as he steadily moved towards her. She didn't cringe when he was so close to her. She could smell his scent, pine needles and mouthwash. Jaelynn found comfort in it as she thought about how tired she was and how she just wanted to close her eyes. He slowly leaned down and kissed the top of her head. He said nothing to her. Instead, he looked toward Kelsey and Chastity. "I'm going to shower. Move her to my room and get some rest." Then he walked off. The girls sat with Jaelynn as she finished her tea. When no one was around, their hands would find hers and give a tight squeeze of strength. Then they guided Jaelynn to the opposite side of the house, away from her room where she was kept prisoner. They pulled back the sheets to the bed that smelled like a pine tree. Jaelynn crawled in, hissing to herself in pain. The sheets were cold, she shivered, and she settled in. Chastity stood at the door, waiting for Kelsey to follow. Kelsey looked into Jaelynn's eyes, depleted of life. "Get some rest." Then both girls walked out the door. The room was big and vacant, aside from the nightstand on the other side of the bed with a book laid across it. Jaelynn couldn't read the title from where she was, and she didn't want to move her aching body. It felt weird to be alone. She could hear Darren getting out of the bathroom and talking to someone. It sounded like Marshall. The door swung open, and she pulled the covers close to her body. Darren's heavy gaze landed on her before moving to the dresser to fish out some boxers. He wore only a towel around his waist. She studied the tattoos on his body. A much larger paw print symbol was on his chest, edged with zigzag patterns that eased into a cloud-like wisps, then turned into a moon hidden behind the clouds. Below was sketched a wolf on his rib cage just under his armpit. It looked up at the moon near his shoulder blade, howling. The tattoo was so detailed, it probably took a few sessions before it was finished, especially the way it blended. But this wasn't what had Jaelynn's attention. It was the undeniable bite marks that scared his skin. They were definitely from an animal, and patches of scars marred his back as if he had been scratched in a fight. A werewolf fight. Marshall followed along with an IV and the stand. "How are you feeling, Jaelynn?" he asked solemnly. Everyone acted as if she had betrayed them. She felt guilty. She had betrayed them. "I'm fine. I don't want that," she said timidly as she pointed at the bag, knowing it would make her head hazy again. "Jaelynn," Darren's stern voice snapped, warning her not to put up a fight. She nibbled her lip, nervous as she obediently stuck out her arm. Marshall gently inserted the needle and set her drip up. Jaelynn didn't even feel the slight sting. "There, you should sleep like a baby tonight. You two have a good night," he said, making his way to the door. "Thank you," Darren said, headed to his side of the bed. Jaelynn shyly waved Marshall goodbye before daring more looks at Darren's marred skin. The bed dipped as it took in the weight of Darren. He scooted close to Jaelynn and wrapped his arms around her. He took in her scent and let out a wolfish growl. Promise me you will never do that again." Jaelynn whispered a soft "I promise." Her words were not retaliated with the whip or growls of anger because this time she meant it. A few days later, the bed shook as Jaelynn thrashed around. The front door opened with a bang, then the door to Darren's room burst open with the same fierceness. Jaelynn, his unmistakable calming voice shouted through the room. "Wake up," he commanded as he was suddenly by her side. Jaelynn's eyes shot open as she heaved for air. "Breathe, it was just a bad dream," Darren spoke as he patted her bed hair down. Jaelynn searched the room, noting that she was still in his room, as she had every night since the integration ceremony. Her head flopped down on her pillow, breathing in his scent. "You all right?" he asked her while his gaze bore holes into her, as if he was waiting for her to crack. "Yes," she nodded her head, but she knew she was far from okay. She replayed her nightmare in her mind, even though it was more like a memory. She was running in the dark, running away from an alarm going off in the distance. She heard a howl near her. Then it all turned dark. She was just about to be whipped when Darren's voice came ripping her from the dream and waking her up. The first thought that came to her mind was how she needed to get out of here, but then she stared into his eyes, feeling the same fear she felt from the first time he spoke to her. And then she felt a wave of comfort, knowing that if she gives herself to him, he will protect her from his wrath and that of the pack. He was her only sense of safety. She quickly pushed all thoughts of running away. That will never happen again if you obey him. Loving him means no more reprimanding. She stared into his eyes, allowing him to pet her all over. The urgency to feel safe overcame her as she reached for the back of his neck and lightly pleaded for him to come closer. His smell was enough alone to make her body relax, but it was still not enough. Over the past couple of days she had become addicted. His lips were on hers like a clash of a storm. His thumb that was caressing her cheek now pulled at her chin, and his tongue found its way inside her. His warmth caused her to forget about the dream, but she needed more of him. She grabbed at the side of his stomach, searching for his skin. She needed as much contact as he would give her. Darren grabbed her wrist a bit too tightly with a reproving growl and pinned it next to her face. "Wait," that was all he said, but she understood. She pouted at her grumpy mate but smiled on the inside as she saw he couldn't conceal how much he liked and approved of her attention towards him. "You didn't come to bed last night," Jaelynn whined, remembering how he had to leave for an emergency just as they were about to go to sleep. Is she okay?" Marshall's voice interrupted as he peeped his head through the doorway. Darren looked at Jaelynn thoughtfully. "I think she's okay. Let's get her some meds, though." Jaelynn's lips went to move but were frozen by his stern glare. "Sure thing." Marshall slipped away in a chipper mood. "You should get up. You will waste the day away." Darren kissed her on the head and dismissed himself as Marshall quickly returned with a syringe. "Good morning, Jaelynn." Jaelynn gave him a scolding look like he should know and stuck out her arm. She no longer had the IV attached to her, but the shots distributed to her by Darren's demands had caused the inner parts of her elbows to become purple. After he distributed the drugs, she quickly ate and began her chores. Jaelynn always felt the most chipper right after Marshall gave her a shot. The pain in her body faded away, and any fearful voices in her head were silenced. She hummed as she gathered the laundry in the garage, avoiding looking around too much in case someone was watching her be curious, and threw them in the wet, sudsy bucket out in the sun. She gave them a good swirl in the water to ensure they were completely submerged before letting them soak. Then, with a bit of skip to her step, she grabbed the basket of already washed clothes and hung them. Jaelynn's hum faltered as she noticed off in the distance that Chastity was farther out into the compound than what Darren had permitted. Chastity wasn't alone, though. She was timidly standing with her head slightly down towards the ground as a man hovered over her. Jaelynn watched as his hands greedily touched Chastity. He nuzzled his head in her neck before turning to walk in the opposite direction. Jaelynn instantly recognized the man as Colton. She tried not to stare as she was all too aware of Chastity returning to the grassy lawn and walked towards the porch. Before she turned on her heel, she turned to Jaelynn and called out, "Jaelynn, come inside when you're done with hanging that basket. We need to talk to you." Chastity stood in the door, half inside the trailer and half outside, sounding gravely disappointed. "All right," Jaelynn said as she grabbed another flowery sheet from the basket and began clipping it to the clothesline. She felt suddenly curious about what Chastity would talk to her about. Her mind, however, quickly lost its train of thought. The sun was shining on her skin, but it wasn't too warm yet. She enjoyed how it felt, how the birds would chirp and how the grass felt between her toes. Darren would approve of her appreciation for nature. A woman, prepping for the change, needed to appreciate nature. So the wolf and her soul knew how to connect to each other. A few minutes later, she carried the empty basket inside and sat with Kelsey and Chastity at the kitchen table. "What's up?" she asked, noting the way they sat. They had nervous looks on their faces. "Darren wanted us to be the ones to tell you," Kelsey whispered. "Tell me what?" She couldn't help but feel a little hurt that her mate didn't want to be the one to tell her something. "You are scheduled for the change this moon," Chastity spoke with her normal serious voice, but it had a hint of some other emotion. "What? But I thought I had to wait for 3 moons before the change." Kelsey looked at Chastity, wondering how much she should tell Jaelynn. "Darren and the pack have reasons to speed up your process." "But, reasons? What reasons? The full moon will happen in 2 weeks from now," Kelsey said. "There are still many preparations to do until then." Chastity spoke as if she was listing them in her head. Like what? She still hadn't wrapped the idea around her mind that she was changing the next moon. A part of her was excited, but a part of her felt like this was wrong. She shoved her doubts out of her mind. The two girls looked at each other again. Normally, these preparations would be done throughout the 3 months and the most important ones a day before the ceremony, but since you don't have that time, Darren wants you to start now. "Starting with your diet," Kelsey chipped in. "What about my diet?" I asked, feeling like they were applying my weight wasn't acceptable for the change or my mate. "When you first turn, there is a short amount of time where your wolf will reject any human food you may eat. To make the transition smoother, you will first need to fast until the night before the ceremony," Kelsey continued to explain as she rubbed her hands against her dress. "Your body most likely has a lot of crud still from before you joined the compound. So unfortunately, you will have to fast longer than Kelsey," Chastity explained. Jaelynn wasn't sure how she felt about not eating for the next 2 weeks, but if it sped up the process so she could meet Darren at all levels and it would make him happy, she would do it. From here on out, you need to be outside as much as possible. You need to be able to bond with your wolf on a deeper level. The love of nature is the most important connection you can have with your wolf. It won't be easy, but we will walk you through it, Kelsey assured. Thank you so much for reading the 8th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps grammar Nazis are welcome. Jaelynn tore at her hair as she swatted away yet another mosquito. They had stopped giving her the shots, and she felt so irritable. Doubts filled her head about the integrity of her mate and mocked her every time she thought about becoming a wolf. Just then, she heard a howl far off in the distance, and she immediately slapped herself. She shook with fists full of hair as she tried to shut out the memories of her integration ceremony. She hit herself again to punish herself for thinking such forbidden thoughts. Jaelynn felt paranoid. She felt like every chirp of a cricket and howl of a dog would alert the compound of what she thought. It didn't help that the people who stayed in the tents and campers always kept an eye on her from a distance, as if they were waiting for me to run. I could run, she thought, but the sudden shout from deep in the compound caused her to erase that thought. They are always watching, even though they keep their distance from her. Only Kelsey, Chastity, and Marshall got close enough to touch her other than her mate. She hadn't noticed this until yesterday when she had tried to take a box from Joshua and he scolded her not to touch him. She looked at him with a confused look and then heard Darren call for her to come to him. Jaelynn remembered how he pulled her to him and breathed in the scent at the crevice of her neck, causing her to feel excited. Is my mate running away with my beta? Nervous, she quickly shook her head no. Don't let the boys get too close to you, okay, Moonlight? Later I told Kelsey what had happened, and with a shocked look on her face, she explained the protectiveness of mates. She still couldn't believe Darren hadn't lost his temper. She told Jaelynn horror stories as she taught her how to sew. It didn't sound like the Darren Jaelynn knew, losing tempers, starting fights, stricter with reprimands. Apparently, he had become calmer since Jaelynn came to the compound. Kelsey explained that he's been very busy with the arrangements for the changing ceremony, and his eagerness may have calmed him down. Jaelynn asked many questions about the changing ceremony, but Kelsey and Chastity couldn't tell her much more. Every moon, they were locked away from everyone in the compound, but they said they could still hear the chanting and the changing, and then the howling. They refused to talk much about the previous girls, but they did mention that they weren't allowed to speak to them again after the ceremony. Sometimes they can spot a changed girl in the crowds when everyone gathers at the compound. This helped Jaelynn to believe in the pack. Kelsey and Chastity were so convinced about the compound, it didn't make sense for her not to. Her constant feeling of fear also drove her to believe in werewolves. She knew she would be reprimanded if she acted out of line. Given that she was yanked from her reality and placed here, she felt little comfort every day. Thinking of just obeying her mate and knowing she wouldn't be punished curved the constant fear that would bubble in her chest from time to time. The drugs helped with the fear, and the voices in her head that gave her doubt. She scratched her head in frustration at the thought of the drugs Marshall had been giving her routinely until recently. They made her brain feel so foggy she couldn't think straight, which meant she couldn't think about worrying. So Jaelynn felt a sense of happiness as it warmed her cheeks. Now she felt like she was being deprived. She was robbed of a bath, food, and Marshall's sweet concoction. Tossing on her patch of grass, she froze as she heard a shout echo through the woods. Then several men's voices smashed together as they all spoke in murmurs. The man sounded pissed as his voice got closer to the compound. I ain't do nothing wrong, his voice came in clearly. Take him to the post, the familiar voice caused Jaelynn to see what was happening excitedly. Darren is back from his night run. Darren, no, you fucking listened to orders the first time you cost us. There was a sudden thud sound, and then gasps for air. Take care of him, Jaelynn could hear Darren say somewhere deep among the makeshift homes. He quickly emerged into sight. The man found his breath again and began to scream. Jaelynn wanted to ask Darren what was happening, but she was sure he would scold her for being noisy. Plus, the pissed expression made Jaelynn want to cower away, especially when it landed on her. He marched straight to her. Did we wake you? No, I couldn't sleep. Darren petted down her wild hair and gave her a concerning look over. Jaelynn was faintly aware of some betas headed towards the house, but she didn't bother to look their way. Jaelynn looked toward Darren, trying to absorb as much comfort as possible before he was off again. She wished she could crawl into his arms as she had after her reprimanding and pretend like she was safe again. Marshall, let's get her something to drink, he shouted toward the group of men who were now on the porch, about to enter the house. Sure thing, boss. Darren turned his attention to Jaelynn. You need your sleep. He patted her cheek with the back of his hand as Marshall returned with a glass. He handed it to Jaelynn, and she gave him a quick thanks before taking a sip. It had a hint of vanilla to it. Jaelynn quickly downed the glass, feeling her stomach feel at ease and warmth come to her cheeks. Darren kissed her forehead. "Get some rest," he whispered to her softly, then walked back to the house with Marshall. She lay down with a smile on her face, no more worried about the man that was screaming. 2 days before the ceremony, Jaelynn felt so weak she could barely complete her chores. This didn't mean Darren let her off easily from helping around the compound. "We are a pack," he would say. "You need to pull your weight," he would scold. She spent most of her days out in the sun. She was sunburned from head to toe. It didn't even matter she wore clothes. The sun's rays still found their way to her delicate white skin and turned it red as the sunset. She loathed the evening. The sunset meant that while everyone got to sleep in their warm, soft beds, she had to sleep in the grass under the stars, feeling colder than she should because of the sunburn she wore that worsened as time went by. Even worse was the time she spent with Darren became few and little. "Wait for the transformation," he would say. "It will all be worth it," he would remind her with a small peck, and off he was all day and sometimes the night. She felt like she wouldn't make it to the ceremony at this rate. Those voices in her head were at an all-time high, and she did what she could to suppress them. "You will get a reprimand for thinking like that," she would scold herself, and then force herself to think of happy thoughts. She didn't allow herself to think of her past. She worried it would be too dangerous, so she clung to her future. A future where she could hide in Darren's arms and not have to be punished. A future where he saw her as his equal. The sun was about to set again, as she loathed the idea of another night out here. She still had laundry to hang because she felt so weak it took her longer to do her chores. And here recently, they had even more tasks, as they peeled potatoes, chopped carrots and such to feed everyone at the feast before the moon. A feast she wouldn't be allowed to eat. The simple smells of potato juices tortured her nose and made her belly grumble. Kelsey also finally started to fast today, but peeling potato skins didn't seem nearly as torturous as it had been for Jaelynn. Her mind all day had been about the taste of mashed potatoes. Breaking her train of thought, a car Jaelynn didn't recognize flew into the dirt parking lot, and a petite girl with recognizable heels came out. She was scurrying her way to the house. It was the girl from the diner. She acted tweaked out and nervous as she hurried to the door and walked in. Seconds later, Darren emerged from the woods. Jaelynn's heart skipped a beat. "He's back early." She excitedly started to walk to him to begin their ritual of a few minutes of talking and kissing before he'd go off. Her feet faltered when she saw him continue to the house without glancing at her. Despite feeling rejected, she tried very hard not to let it bother her. She wouldn't want to make him angry. He's probably just busy. He marched into the house, slamming the door behind him. Their voices echoed out into the woods. "That won't be a problem, Bailey. They are close too. I said I got this," he shouted. "Jaelynn will be changed soon, which won't longer be a threat." There was silence. "Changed to be your mate?" More silence. Then Jaelynn watched as the girl left the house. She hurried to her car, but then she didn't get in. She turned to Jaelynn, watching her hang the laundry as Jaelynn stared back. Then as quietly as she could, she tiptoed to Jaelynn. "Hi Jaelynn, right?" she whispered to her. Jaelynn looked towards the house, saw no one was watching, and nodded her head. "I'm Bailey. Look, I have to warn you, you need to get out of here." Jaelynn said nothing but stopped hanging the laundry. Leave? She couldn't leave, not when she was so close to being connected to Darren and the pack. But she whispered, "Listen, all of this is a crock of shit. There's no such thing as werewolves. I was in your shoes. I was meant to be his mate, but then I never went through with the ceremony. They said my body was too tainted by the heroin. I'm forced to do their bidding now. But I'm telling you, I ain't never seen any of them shift. They take women and force them into this dynamic so they can control everything about you. You will lose yourself in this place." Jaelynn shook her head, not wanting to hear it. Of course it's true. How could she say differently? No, Jaelynn said in denial. "It is. It's a crock of shit. None of it is true. The police have been doing active searches for you all in these woods. They are building a case on Darren and everyone associated with the compound. You need to get out. The cops can keep you safe. Please." "No," Jaelynn shouted. "Keep your voice down. I will not. Lies are not tolerated here," Jaelynn shouted back. Bailey stepped away from her, realizing that Jaelynn was already committed. "Everything okay out here?" Darren's voice rang through the air as he stood on the porch. Jaelynn had all the power now. She could send this woman to be reprimanded just like she had. Instead, she gave the woman a warning look. "Everything is fine." Darren nodded his head and watched as Bailey left the compound. Then he walked inside without saying a word to Jaelynn. She finished hanging the last bits of clothes, feeling the pain of Darren's rejection. She didn't even bother to think over what Bailey had told her. She would be with Darren soon. Thank you so much for reading the 9th chapter of The Wolf Cult. If you like what you have read so far, please leave an emoji or tell me what you think. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. Less than 3 Ps grammar Nazis are welcome. Kelsey kneeled at her patch of grass while Jaelynn kneeled at the patch of grass on the opposite side. Darren, Joshua, Marshall, and Colton all stood hovering over the 2 girls to help with the preparations for tomorrow. She couldn't help but look at Darren's devilish look and feel worried. Over the past 2 weeks, his hair had grown more and more out of control. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month, and he seemed so close to coming undone. It didn't help that he got more distant from her as time got closer to the full moon. She felt happy that she had at least gotten to talk to him before tonight's preparations. Darren had told her what to expect tonight. Jaelynn's mouth had watered when he said she could finally eat. The men's clothes were covered in mud and blood from carrying a deer from the woods. It looked like it was mauled by something but freshly dead. It lay on the grass between Kelsey and Jaelynn. "Colton, get cutting," Marshall demanded, and he went to wash his hands inside the house. She watched the men bustling about, but her only thoughts were of food and how she would probably be the one scrubbing their clothes clean tomorrow. Tomorrow, Jaelynn's mind wandered to what she would have to do. She'd finish her chores and then, the changing ceremony. It seemed too good to be true. Colton began hacking away at chunks of meat from the deer. Joshua pulled a decent-sized metal circle meant for a bonfire and stacked wood in it. Darren was telling Colton what parts to cut and put in what piles. 3 piles were laid out, 1 for Jaelynn, 1 for Kelsey, and 1 for the men. Kelsey and Jaelynn's only jobs right now were to kneel obediently and bow their heads. The waiting was killing Jaelynn. She couldn't wait to put her mouth on a chunk of meat. Marshall came out and put chairs around the fire pit, and Joshua got the flames to flare up. Even the smell of the wood burning made her hungry. "All right, start putting those on the fire and give the girls their portions," Darren said as he went to one of the chairs and sat. He was in a direct line of looking at Jaelynn with a smirk on his face. Colton didn't even bother to hand her the meat. He just tossed it on the floor in front of her. Red, bloody chunks of meat splattered the grass with its juices. Jaelynn thought for sure she was losing her mind. "What's this?" she thought. She looked up at Darren and could tell by his smirk he wanted her to eat the raw meat in front of her. Even in her state of hunger, the idea of eating raw meat didn't sound appetizing. She stared at the repulsive chunks and wondered what would happen if she chose not to eat. The idea of disappointing her mate came to mind. That was alone enough to make her try. However, her mind also went back to the night she was reprimanded. Her stomach churned in fear. Her stomach felt queasy as she picked it up and brought it to her nose. It had a pungent metallic smell to it. Jaelynn had to swallow the bit of bile that came up. She looked over at Kelsey, who was already gnawing on the bloody meat, struggling with how chewy it was. She could hear the men laughing at one another. "How's your mate?" Joshua asked to the group. There was a large huff of air before Colton spoke. "She's really not happy. She is the only one that doesn't get to change." Their conversation mushed together as Jaelynn struggled with the idea of eating raw meat. Jaelynn looked back at Darren, knowing it would make him happy if she did what was expected. So she raised it to her mouth and worked the meat into swallowable chunks. She tried to taste the meat and feel the gushy, uncooked texture as little as possible. After every bite, she had to stop herself from gagging. Her stomach felt even more empty than before. Darren wore a look of approval as all the men watched Kelsey and her eat their raw meat. All the while, they enjoyed their freshly cooked meat. The smells of spices permeated the air. Jaelynn tried to pretend she was eating what they were, but it just made her realization all the worse. On her hands and knees, she hurled all the chunks of meat she had just eaten back into the grass. Their soft murmurs of conversation stopped to watch. "Colton," Darren's masculine voice hit through the silence. "Go cut her some more pieces." Jaelynn groaned inwardly. She didn't want any more. With a chipper tune, Colton hurried and cut her some more chunks and threw them next to the bile, just barely missing it. She stared at it hesitantly. "Eat all of it, Jaelynn. You need it for the transformation tomorrow." She heard Darren's words, but her eyes were focused in the distance. Think of the transformation. Think of how nice it will be to be with Darren, to be his mate, with determination. Jaelynn started again eating the meat. The next day was the worst day of preparations. Both Kelsey and Jaelynn were sick to the bone, often puking or going to the bathroom. Marshall assured both of them it was a part of the process. Despite being sick, they had to make preparations for the whole pack to come tonight and finish their chores. The men seemed even more unhinged than usual. They talked lowly amongst themselves, and people came and went with information to tell them. Even Bailey made several visits. Her eyes would make a plea with Jaelynn, but she made no move to talk to her again. By night, Kelsey and Jaelynn were kneeling in the grass wearing white nightgowns and bowed heads. The pack members came quietly, spoke softly, and ate and drank at the tables. No one bothered the girls. Jaelyn's wooziness made her feel like she could hallucinate any second. She focused on her breathing, scared it would stop the ceremony if she were to come unhinged. Soon she would be changed, a werewolf. The night got closer to midnight when finally the girls were addressed. "All right, we have about an hour till it's time to start phasing. Let's start our ceremony." The man who had made the announcements last time shouted in a loud announcer's voice. People crowded around the girls. Darren stood before them as Marshall brought 2 cups. "Tonight," Darren's voice rumbled through the crowd, "we will unite 2 new members to our pack. One of them my mate. May we give them a warm welcome." "For the pack," he shouted. "For the pack," they all shouted back. Then Darren nodded at Marshall to hand the girls the cups. Jaelynn smelled it. It smelled strong like alcohol and natural like roots with a hint of licorice. She brought it to her lips, and it warmed her empty, upset stomach, but the taste was not pleasant. She had to hold her nose and chuck the drink as fast as possible. When Jaelynn finished, she raised the cup. "For the pack," the crowd chanted. Kelsey followed shortly behind Jaelynn. "For the pack," they chanted again. "Now we wait," Darren shouted. "When it's about midnight, the witches will arrive, and we will start the passing of blood with the pack." Immediately Jaelynn started not to feel good. Her head felt heavy, and everything spun. For the pack," she would hear the whispers, but as she looked at everyone's faces, their lips would not move. "Ha ha ha!" A laugh from here and then there would linger in the air, but no one seemed to be laughing. She breathed in and out, focusing on staying alert. She could feel her own heartbeat pulsating through her body in a rhythmic beat. "AAWWWOOOO." A howl cracked through the compound and echoed into the night air. It was heard over the lipless chanting, but as her head snapped up, she saw no recognition in anyone's face that they had also heard the howl. Their still faces just slandered left and right. The atmosphere changed from purple to teal to dark blue, as if they were in some color-fogged light. "The wolf," Jaelynn thought excitedly. Her eyes searched everywhere for the beast. Then, from the woods, she saw its big black and gray fur dance in the wind as it trotted toward her. It came face to face with her. She reached out to touch the beast. Although she denied it until now, she doubted werewolves were real. Her beat drummed through her chest as she looked into the beast's steady eyes. She slowly reached a hand out to touch it. Suddenly, the beast was gone, replaced with Darren shouting, "Jaelynn, Kelsey, stay put. Colton, look after them. Everyone spread out and deal with them," Darren shouted. Jaelynn was shocked to find herself on the floor, looking up at the starry sky, spinning like a tornado of light. Heat simmered on her cheeks like she was sunbathing on a summer day. She groaned. "How did I get here?" she asked herself. And the world did little to stop spinning. She giggled to herself. From a distance, she swore she heard a siren. No, not a siren. A wolf's howl. No, maybe a siren. When she finally decided it was a siren, it turned into the world's most annoying female whine. "Jaelynn, fight this. It's not real. Jaelynn, we have to go." Jaelynn looked and was surprised. She could see the girl's lips move with her mouth. It was Bailey. All the while behind her she could still hear, "For the pack, for the pack." She looked to see who was still chanting, but there was no longer anyone standing around her. She sat up in the search of her mate, biting back the sudden sorrow she felt for being abandoned. "Jaelynn, Jaelynn," she tapped Jaelynn's face repeatedly, trying to get her to focus. "We have to go now if you want to be free of this place." Her voice sounded scary, desperate, like a girl screaming bloody murder but in a whisper. Jaelynn was able to cling to what she was saying. "Think about it. You are drugged. You wouldn't have to be drugged to become a wolf, would you? It's brainwashing. Please, I am trying to save you." Jaelynn stared at the girl with her lined lips pressed together, making them appear like she had no lips. "No wonder my mate didn't choose her." Then, behind Bailey, shone a white light. Jaelynn reached for it, and she saw herself staring back at her. She stared at it in confusion. She slightly noted the warmth in her body and the happiness she felt, and left out a string of giggles until Jaelynn's self spoke in her sassy, serious tone, a voice she hadn't used since coming to the compound. "Only females need to be changed," her voice snapped at her. She fought to focus on herself floating in the air. "You cannot see a wolf change until after you have changed." "Jaelynn, please stand," Bailey pleaded as she yanked her up. Somehow, she was managing to stand with Bailey. Jaelynn wasn't sure how she got off the floor but felt like dancing. Bailey's hands tightened on her, making her feel like she was in some giant seaweed body wrap and the seaweed was eating at her skin. She wanted to find Bailey, but her own voice stopped her. "You have to be drugged for the changing," herself told her, and with that, Jaelynn drunkenly staggered where Bailey wanted her to go. "I'm not supposed to be here," she thought, even though she couldn't come up with any reasons. She clung to Bailey and stared at the gravel on the floor, too disorientated to be bothered by the sharp edges jamming in her feet. Each step caused the gravel to become blurred. Then she felt her eyelids go heavy. Jaelynn stood out in an extended field with no one for miles around. Off in the distance, she heard a soft bark. She looked to see a pack of wolves staring back at her. "The wolves are so friendly. I want to be one." She took off towards them. "Oh, you are having a good time," a familiar voice commented, pulling her away from the wolves. She opened her eyes to the backseat of a car coming to a stop. Red and blue lights flashed in and out through the window. Bailey's frizzy blonde hair bobbed as she turned to check on Jaelynn in the backseat. "Don't worry, you are safe now." Happy to be told she was safe, she closed her eyes again. She saw the wolves and began to run to them. Jaelynn felt an empty void before she woke to the steady beat of the heart monitor. She opened her eyes to look for him sitting on the rocking chair, but that wasn't what she found. Instead, she found a much older gentleman in a suit staring back at her. He wasn't in a rocking chair either, but a nice comfy sofa. A sofa with no little flower designs. No, it was a modern green beige sofa. Jaelynn jerked up to examine herself. She was shocked to see she wasn't chained to the bed that you would find a patient in who went to the hospital. She looked around and felt suddenly relieved, but that relief was filled with fear. She shouldn't be here. Darren would be furious. Would this mean she'd have to do the process all over again? "Hello, Jaelynn," the voice in the chair spoke, causing her to startle. "I'm Detective Grayson. I'm working on your case. There will be time for questions later, but for now I want you to rest knowing you are safe. You have round-the-clock police protection." "Police protection? What happened? Did I not turn?" She forced herself to remember, but everything felt foggy. "Can you tell me what you know?" Feeling like it was a trap, she didn't dare to say anything that could get her reprimanded. I don't know," she stumbled to figure out her reality. She took the drink for the changing ceremony. And then what? Did it not work? Did Darren throw her to the curb to find a new mate? The man's peppered eyebrows squished together as he looked at her solemnly. "I'm afraid you were abducted by a cult. The same compound that takes an average of 12 girls a year, brainwashes and conforms them. They use agents such as drugs, lies, and abuse to convince these women that these men are werewolves, and soon they will be as well. We have managed to arrest Darren Hopkins and several other cult members at this time. We will be sending someone to come by later today to assess your mental state and help you through this process. You should rest for now." She soaked in the information he told her like a dried-out sponge. This isn't a test. The realization that it was all a lie was too much. "I am weak," she cried. Heavy tears spilled from her eyes as she tried to catch her breath. "I am weak for believing it. I told myself not to fall for it." The detective let a nurse in to calm Jaelynn down. Jaelynn was unaware of herself hyperventilating. She gasped for air but felt none. She couldn't think of anything but for the pack. "It's all right," the sweet nurse comforted as she put a syringe into Jaelynn's IV. Jaelynn looked at the needle with complete and utter fear. No more drugs," she wailed. The nurse gave calming words of assurance, but she didn't listen to her as she fell back asleep, back to the wolves in the meadow. Thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this telling story video, please do not forget to give us a like, comment, share, and subscribe.